The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the rows of cubicles. It was another late night at the office, and I sat hunched over my keyboard, fingers tapping out lines of code that blurred together in my exhaustion. The hum of computers and distant chatter from coworkers had long since faded into white noise, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and the gnawing pressure to meet yet another impossible deadline. I glanced at the clock on my monitor, 9:47 p.m. Most people would have gone home hours ago, but not me. Not when she was still here. She was my boss, Claire Bennett, the woman who could command a room with nothing more than her presence. She wasn't just any boss, she was the kind you couldn't help but admire, even if her expectations were sky-high. Claire had built this company from scratch, turning it into one of the most innovative tech startups in the city. Her ambition was magnetic, her confidence unshakable. But tonight, there was something different about her. Something quieter, almost fragile. Earlier, as I passed by her glass-walled office, I'd caught a glimpse of her sitting behind her desk. Her head rested in her hands, shoulders slumped, an image so unlike the poised leader everyone knew. For a moment, I hesitated outside her door, torn between knocking and retreating to my own corner. In the end, I chose the latter, telling myself she probably needed space. But now, hours later, curiosity tugged at me like an invisible thread. My stomach twisted as I thought about how much I wanted to check on her, not because it was expected of me, but because I cared. More than I should, maybe. That realization made me shift uncomfortably in my chair. My feelings for Claire weren't new, though I'd done everything I could to bury them deep beneath professionalism and self-control. After all, she was my boss. Crossing that line? Impossible. Or so I told myself every time her laugh echoed down the hallway or her gaze lingered on mine, just a second too long. As I stared blankly at my screen, the sound of footsteps broke through my thoughts. They were soft, but deliberate, clicking against the tiled floor. My pulse quickened instinctively. Without looking up, I knew exactly who it was. Only Claire walked like that, with purpose, but also grace, as if each step carried the weight of responsibility balanced perfectly with poise. Still here? Her voice came softly, tinged with surprise, and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe relief. I turned my chair slowly, meeting her eyes for the first time that evening. Even in the dim light, they were striking, a deep shade of green flecked with gold, framed by lashes far too perfect to be natural. Tonight, though, they looked tired. Haunted, almost. Still, they held me captive, rooting me to the spot. Yeah, I replied, forcing a small smile. Just finishing up some last-minute debugging. She nodded, her lips curving into a faint smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes. You always were a perfectionist. Her words hung in the air, warm but weighted, as if she meant more than what she said. I swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of how close she was standing. Close enough that I could smell the subtle scent of her perfume, something floral with a hint of citrus, understated yet intoxicating. You shouldn't push yourself too hard, she added after a pause, her tone softer now. Even machines need rest sometimes. It wasn't the first time she'd said something like that to me, but tonight, it felt different. There was an intimacy in her concern that sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I watched as she leaned casually against the edge of my desk, crossing one leg over the other. The movement was effortless, elegant, but it left me flustered all the same. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken tension. Then, almost hesitantly, she asked, "Do you ever wonder what it's like to let go?" The question caught me off guard. Let go? Of what? Work? Responsibilities? Or something else entirely? Before I could ask for clarification, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I mean, we spend so much of our lives trying to control everything, to plan, predict, prepare. But sometimes, she trailed off, her gaze drifting toward the window where the city lights twinkled like stars. Sometimes I think we forget what it feels like to lose control. Her confession startled me. This wasn't the Claire I knew, the one who thrived on order and precision. This version of her was raw, vulnerable, and terrifyingly beautiful. I guess I haven't thought about it much, I admitted finally, my voice trembling slightly. Letting go sounds risky. She chuckled softly, the sound low and melodic. That's what makes it worth it, don't you think? Before I could respond, her phone buzzed loudly, breaking the spell. With a sigh, she straightened up, glancing at the screen before slipping it back into her pocket. I should go, she said, though her tone suggested reluctance. But thank you, for staying late. You didn't have to. It's part of the job, I murmured, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Because deep down, I knew it wasn't just about the job anymore. As she walked away, her heels clicking softly against the floor, I found myself staring after her, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever had shifted between us tonight, it wasn't going to fade easily. If anything, it only made the pull stronger, the longing sharper, and as I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That somewhere along the way, we'd both find ourselves facing choices we weren't ready to make. Choices that might change everything. Little did I know, the night was far from over. The city outside was alive with its usual chaos, honking cars, distant sirens, and the faint murmur of people passing by on the street below. But inside the office, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of us. Claire lingered for a moment longer than necessary after her earlier comment about losing control, her presence filling the room in ways I couldn't ignore. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the elevator, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. I should have left then. Packed up my laptop, grabbed my coat, and gone home to the quiet solitude of my apartment. But something kept me rooted to my chair, a restless energy that refused to let me walk away. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at me before she left, as if there were words unspoken hanging between us. Or maybe it was the gnawing curiosity about what she'd meant when she talked about letting go. Whatever it was, it tugged at me until I finally stood, slinging my bag over my shoulder and heading toward the stairs instead of the exit. The rooftop access door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, the cool night air rushing to greet me. The building's roof wasn't exactly a secret spot, but it wasn't commonly used either. It was one of those forgotten spaces where you could escape the noise of the city, and the noise in your head, if only for a little while. And there she was, standing near the edge, her silhouette framed against the glittering skyline. Claire didn't turn around right away, but I knew she heard me approach. Her posture shifted subtly, shoulders relaxing as if she'd been expecting me, or hoping I'd come. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should speak or simply retreat back downstairs. But then she glanced over her shoulder, her lips curving into a faint smile that made my stomach flip. You followed me, she said softly, her voice carrying easily in the stillness of the night. I faltered, suddenly feeling ridiculous for coming up here. I just thought you might need some company. Her smile widened slightly, though it carried a hint of sadness. Or maybe you needed an excuse to get out of that stuffy office? She wasn't wrong. Still, I shrugged, trying to play it casual as I stepped closer. Maybe both. We stood side by side in silence for a while, the city sprawled out before us like a living painting. The lights twinkled endlessly, each one representing someone else's story, someone else's life. But tonight, none of that mattered. All that existed was this rooftop, this moment, and her. Do you ever feel like we're all just pretending? She asked, suddenly, breaking the quiet. Her tone was contemplative, almost wistful. Like we put on these masks every day and convince ourselves they're real? I blinked, caught off guard by the depth of her question. Sometimes, I admitted. Especially at work. Everyone wants to seem so put together, so confident. But underneath, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if anyone really feels okay. Claire nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Exactly. That's why I came up here tonight. To breathe. To remember what it feels like to be human for a change. Her words resonated with me more than I cared to admit. There was a raw honesty in them that stripped away the layers of professionalism we usually hid behind. For once, she wasn't my boss, the woman who demanded perfection and expected nothing less than excellence. She was just Claire. A person, flawed and searching, just like me. Without thinking, I blurted out, "You don't have to pretend with me, you know." She turned to look at me then, her eyes searching mine as if trying to gauge whether I truly meant it. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was making myself. "You don't have to act like everything's fine all the time. Not with me. I see you, Claire. Even when you think no one does." For a moment, she didn't say anything. The weight of my confession hung between us, heavy and fragile. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a soft, self-deprecating sound that made my heart ache. "You shouldn't say things like that," she murmured, shaking her head. "It makes it harder to keep pretending." "Why do you want to pretend?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "With me, of all people?" Her expression shifted, something unreadable flickering across her face. "Because you deserve better than someone like me," she said finally, her tone laced with a mixture of regret and resolve. "Someone who doesn't have their life figured out. Someone who can't even figure out themselves." Her admission stunned me. This wasn't the Claire I thought I knew, the one who seemed to have everything under control. This version of her was achingly real, and it made my chest tighten with a mix of empathy and longing. Before I could respond, she took a step closer, closing the distance between us. My breath hitched as she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, electrifying every nerve ending. "You make it hard to keep my walls up," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "And I hate that. Because I know I shouldn't feel this way about you. About anyone." My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the distant hum of the city. "Feel what way?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Instead of replying, she leaned in, her lips hovering dangerously close to mine. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to just the two of us. Every rational thought screamed at me to pull back, to remind myself of the boundaries we were crossing. But I couldn't move. I didn't want to then. Just as suddenly as she'd moved closer, she pulled away, stepping back with a sharp intake of breath. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes wide with a mixture of panic and desire. "This shouldn't have happened," she muttered, running a hand through her hair. "I'm sorry." "I shouldn't have." "No," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I expected. "Don't apologize. Please." She stared at me, conflicted emotions swirling in her gaze. "You don't understand. It's impossible. You work for me. I'm your boss. If anyone found out, they won't," I said quickly, taking a step toward her. "No one has to know. This doesn't have to mean anything if you don't want it to." "That's not the point," she snapped, though her tone lacked conviction. "The point is, I shouldn't feel this way about you. And you shouldn't feel this way about me." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but they also ignited something inside me, a stubborn determination to prove her wrong. "Who says I do?" I challenged, my voice steady, despite the storm raging within me. "Maybe I just care about you." "Is that so wrong?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might argue further. But then her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. "No," she admitted quietly. "It's not wrong. It's just complicated." "Complicated doesn't mean impossible," I countered, taking another step closer. "And it doesn't mean we have to ignore how we feel." She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell behind us. We both froze, the spell broken as reality crashed back in. Claire stepped away, putting distance between us just as the door creaked open and one of our coworkers poked his head out. "Hey, I thought I saw someone up here," he said, glancing between us. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Claire replied curtly, smoothing her hair and straightening her posture. "Just getting some fresh air." He nodded, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. "All right, well, don't stay out too late. See you tomorrow." As he disappeared back inside, Claire let out a shaky breath, avoiding my gaze. "We should go," she said, her voice clipped. It's late. I wanted to protest, to insist that we finish this conversation, but I could see the walls going back up around her. So instead, I nodded silently and followed her to the door, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily between us. That night, as I lay awake in bed replaying every moment on the rooftop, I realized something. Whatever line I'd been afraid to cross with Claire, we'd already crossed it. And there was no turning back now. The days that followed our rooftop encounter were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. Claire acted as though nothing had happened, slipping back into her role as my boss, with practiced ease. She gave directives in meetings, offered critiques on projects, and maintained the same professional distance she always had. But there was something different now, a subtle shift in the air whenever we were in the same room. It wasn't just me imagining it, I could see it in the way her gaze lingered a fraction too long when she thought no one was looking, or how her voice softened ever so slightly when addressing me directly. I tried to focus on work, to bury myself in spreadsheets and coding tasks like I always did. But my mind kept drifting back to that night, the warmth of her touch, the intensity in her eyes, the way she'd pulled away, but not before letting me glimpse something raw and real beneath her polished exterior. Each memory felt like a thread pulling at the edges of my self-control, unraveling the carefully constructed walls I'd built around my feelings for her. It wasn't until Friday afternoon, during an impromptu team outing to celebrate hitting a major project milestone, that things began to change again. The office had rented out a cozy wine bar downtown, its dim lighting and soft jazz music creating an atmosphere far removed from the sterile confines of our workspace. Everyone was relaxed, laughing over shared plates of charcuterie and glasses of red wine. Even Claire seemed more at ease than usual, her guard lowered by the casual setting. I found myself sitting across from her at one of the high-top tables, trying, and failing, to concentrate on the conversation happening around us. Every time she laughed at someone's joke or tilted her head thoughtfully while listening, my attention zeroed in on her. The scent of her perfume drifted toward me intermittently, mingling with the aroma of aged oak barrels and crushed grapes, and each inhalation felt like a secret tether drawing me closer to her. At some point, the group decided to play a round of trivia, splitting into teams and competing for bragging rights. Claire ended up on my team, much to my surprise and delight. As we huddled together over the tablet displaying the questions, our shoulders brushed lightly, sending tiny jolts through me every time. Her hair fell forward as she leaned in to read the screen, strands catching the golden glow of the pendant lights above us. I caught myself staring more than once, only snapping out of it when she glanced up and raised an eyebrow. "You're awfully quiet tonight," she murmured, her lips curving into a teasing smile. "Too intimidated by my trivia skills?" "Hardly," I shot back, forcing a grin despite the flutter in my chest. "I'm just strategizing." "Well, strategize faster," she teased, nudging me gently with her elbow. "We're losing." Her touch lingered longer than necessary, and I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to lean into it. Instead, I focused on the next question, determined to distract myself. But even as we debated answers and celebrated small victories, the tension between us remained palpable, crackling like static electricity in the air. When the game finally wound down and most of the team dispersed to grab another round of drinks or step outside for fresh air, Claire and I stayed behind at the table. The background chatter faded into white noise as we sat facing each other, the space between us charged with unspoken possibilities. "I didn't know you were such a trivia whiz," I said lightly, swirling the last dregs of wine in my glass. "Any other hidden talents I should be aware of?" She smirked, leaning back in her chair with an air of playful confidence. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Her tone sent a shiver down my spine, equal parts flirtation and challenge. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching taut like a bowstring. Then, almost hesitantly, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing against mine where they rested near my glass. The contact was fleeting, barely there, but it ignited a fire low in my belly all the same. "You've been avoiding me," she said softly, her voice tinged with something that sounded like hurt. "I haven't," I protested, though the denial felt hollow even to my own ears. "I've just been busy." "Busy pretending nothing happened," she countered, her gaze piercing through my defenses. "Because I've been doing the same thing, and it's exhausting." Her honesty caught me off guard, leaving me momentarily speechless. Here was the vulnerability I'd glimpsed on the rooftop, laid bare without pretense or hesitation. It made my heart ache, not just for her, but for us. I don't know what to do, I admitted finally, my voice trembling slightly. About any of this. About you. Her expression softened, her thumb tracing idle circles on the edge of her glass. Neither do I. But maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now. What are you saying? I asked, my pulse quickening. I'm saying, she paused, choosing her words carefully. That maybe we can take this one step at a time. See where it goes. Without worrying about what anyone else thinks, or what should happen. Her suggestion hung in the air, heavy with implication. Part of me wanted to leap at the opportunity, to throw caution to the wind and let whatever was growing between us bloom fully. But another part, the rational, cautious part, whispered warnings of consequences and complications. This wasn't just a crush or a harmless flirtation. This was dangerous territory, fraught with potential fallout that could affect both our lives in ways I wasn't ready to face. Still, as I looked into her eyes, seeing the same mix of longing and uncertainty reflected back at me, I realized I couldn't walk away. Not yet. Maybe not ever, so what happens now? I asked quietly, my hand instinctively reaching for hers under the table. Our fingers intertwined, tentative but electric, and I felt a surge of warmth spread through me. Now, she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her gaze, we figure it out together. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, letting the weight of her words settle over me like a comforting blanket. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges or obstacles we might face, it felt worth it. Because in that moment, with her hand in mine and the world fading into the background, I knew one thing for certain, I didn't want to let go. The weekend passed in a haze of restless anticipation. Every text notification made my heart leap, only to sink when I realized it wasn't from her. Claire had retreated back into her usual routine after our conversation at the wine bar, polite but distant, as though the fragile thread connecting us might snap if she pulled too hard. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of her words, we figure it out together. Those 5 simple words replayed in my mind like a mantra, anchoring me even as doubt crept in. By Monday morning, the office felt suffocating. The hum of keyboards and muted conversations grated on my nerves, amplifying the tension that had been building inside me since Friday night. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting to Claire. Was she regretting what she'd said? Did she already wish we could go back to how things were before? It wasn't until late afternoon that I finally saw her again. She emerged from a meeting room looking frazzled, her blazer slung over one arm and her hair slightly mussed. For a moment, our eyes met across the open floor plan, and something unspoken passed between us, a question, a plea, an invitation. Then, without a word, she turned and headed toward the stairwell. My feet moved before my brain could catch up. I followed her, my pulse pounding in time with each step. When I pushed open the door to the rooftop, she was already there, leaning against the railing with her back to me. The wind tugged at her shirt, molding it to her frame, and for a second, I hesitated. What if this was a mistake? What if crossing this line changed everything irreparably? But then she turned, and all my doubts dissolved. Her expression was guarded yet achingly vulnerable, her green eyes searching mine as if trying to find answers to questions she hadn't asked aloud. You came, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves and distant traffic below. I did, I replied, stepping closer. I couldn't stay away. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but instead, she looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. I've spent 2 days trying to convince myself this is a bad idea, she admitted, her tone tinged with frustration. That it's reckless, selfish, impossible. But no matter how many reasons I come up with, none of them feel strong enough to make me stop thinking about you. Her confession hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the breath from my lungs. My throat tightened, and I struggled to form a coherent response. Claire, I started, my voice trembling. You're not alone in this. I've been fighting it too. Fighting us. But I can't anymore. She closed the distance between us in 2 quick strides, stopping just inches away. Her scent enveloped me, citrus and florals, sharp and sweet, and I had to resist the urge to reach for her. Instead, I stood frozen, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure she could hear it. "What are we doing?" she whispered, her gaze flickering between my eyes and my lips. "This isn't supposed to happen. You're my employee. I'm your boss." We should," I interrupted, surprising even myself with the conviction in my voice. "Because none of those labels matter right now. All that matters is how I feel when I'm with you. How you make me want to be braver, better. How you make me feel alive." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. Then, slowly, tentatively, she lifted her hand to cup my cheek. Her touch was feather-light, but it sent a jolt of electricity coursing through me, grounding me in the here and now. "This scares me," she admitted, her thumb brushing gently along my jawline. "Not because of who you are, but because of who I am. Because I don't know if I can give you what you deserve." "You don't have to have all the answers," I murmured, leaning into her touch. "Just, trust me. Trust us." Her eyes searched mine, filled with longing and fear and something else I couldn't quite name. And then, before I could process what was happening, she leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't gentle or tentative, it was raw and desperate, a collision of pent-up emotions that left me dizzy. Her lips pressed against mine with an urgency that took my breath away, her fingers threading through my hair as she pulled me closer. I responded instinctively, my arms wrapping around her waist as I surrendered to the moment. The world around us faded, the city lights, the cool breeze, the distant hum of traffic, all of it disappeared, leaving only the heat of her body against mine and the taste of her lips. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other's. Her eyes were glassy, her cheeks flushed, and for the first time, I saw her completely unguarded. There was no mask, no pretense, just Claire, beautiful and imperfect and achingly real. "I shouldn't have done that," she whispered, though her grip on me didn't loosen. But I couldn't stop myself. "Good," I said, my voice hoarse with emotion. "Because I didn't want you to." For a moment, we simply held each other, the weight of what had just happened settling between us like a storm cloud. Then, reluctantly, she stepped back, running a shaky hand through her hair. "This changes everything," she said, her tone heavy with resignation. "If anyone finds out, they won't," I assured her quickly, though the uncertainty in her eyes mirrored my own fears. "We'll figure it out. Together." She nodded, but the worry lingered in her expression. "Promise me something," she said after a pause. "Promise me we'll be careful. Not just for us, but for everyone else." "If this gets out, it won't," I interrupted firmly, stepping closer again. "I promise." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, though the tension in her posture remained. "Okay," she said softly, reaching out to take my hand. "Then let's take this one day at a time." As we stood there, fingers intertwined and hearts racing, I knew we were standing on the edge of something neither of us fully understood. This wasn't just a kiss, it was a declaration, a leap of faith, a promise to navigate the unknown together. But even as hope swelled within me, the reality of our situation loomed large. Whatever path lay ahead, it wouldn't be easy. And as much as I wanted to believe we could handle it, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind warning me that love like this always came with a price.